I was out basically all weekend, and at some point during that time, this thing got announced. This is the Valve Steam Deck. Now, throughout this video, I'm going to try not to say Stream Deck, the little Elgato macro pad, but I'm not going to make any promises. So basically what this is Valve's second attempt at making a console of sorts. Now, the word console sort of lost its meaning over the years. Basically what this is a handheld PC running SteamOS 3.0. And unlike the failure known as the Steam machines from the 2012-2013 era, this is going to be approached in a very different way. So rather than relying on third-party OEMs, which may or may not even make any machines, this is going to be a first-party Valve machine. Obviously, Valve isn't a manufacturer, so they will have to outsource it to a separate company, but this is going to be a Valve-branded machine. And the difference, which should be fairly evident, is the fact that it's a handheld console. Now, if you said something about this 5 years ago, no one would have really cared. But because of how well the Nintendo Switch has done, handhelds have sort of regained their popularity. And also, because this is SteamOS, it is going to be Linux, but Linux gaming is not what it was like back in 2013. Speaking of SteamOS though, versions 1 and 2 were Debian-based, but for some reason, with SteamOS version 3, it's now going to be an Arch-based distro. I don't know why they've decided to do that, but what I can say is I was gaming on Arch before it was cool. It's also going to be shipping with a highly customized version of KDE. Now, this is important because even though most of the time you are going to be using it like a console that just has Steam installed, but it is running full-fledged Linux, so you can just go and use it like a regular Linux computer. You can plug in any peripherals that work on Linux, so if you want to do keyboard and mouse, you can go and do that. If you want to I don't know, set it up as a media center computer and have your speakers plugged into it, or maybe you want to plug in some audio gear and use it as a recording PC. Literally anything you could do on Linux can be done on this system, because basically what it is a computer that has a controller attached to it. And because it is just a handheld computer running an x86 CPU and fairly standard parts outside of that, you can just go and install a different operating system altogether. So if you want to turn this into a handheld Windows computer, that'll work perfectly fine. Now, there is one caveat with that. So all of the articles out there are saying you can install Windows 10 will work, but Windows 11, if you go check out the spec sheet, actually has a really interesting restriction. So if we go down to here, it needs a display that is at least 720p, which it does have, but the display must also be greater than 9 inches. This has a 7-inch screen, so you probably won't be able to install Windows 11 unless that isn't a hard restriction. Now, what makes this exciting isn't the fact that it's a handheld gaming computer, because while that's certainly cool, it's by no means an original concept. If we just go onto YouTube and look at how many videos Linus Tech Tips has done on them, we'll see there's certainly plenty of options out there. The reason why this is exciting is because this is a Valve machine, and Valve has been putting a lot of effort into getting Linux gaming actually working well. Back when the Steam machines were a thing, Steam had basically no support for Linux games. Sure, the source games would work, and that's perfectly fine, and I believe there was about 200 titles that actually had Linux native binaries, and that might sound like a lot of games, but the quantity of games doesn't really matter. It's the quality and whether the games you want to play are actually working. For anything else, you would have to set up Wine manually. I don't believe Lutris even existed back then, so you'd be digging through forum posts and trying to work out which Wine settings to actually use, and even then, if someone managed to get it working on their system, because Wine just didn't work as well back then, it might just not work on your system, and it was just a massive pain, and that's part of the reason why it was a commercial failure. But since then, Valve has learned from their mistake. They realized they're never going to be able to get developers to start releasing Linux native binaries because Linux just isn't that big of a market. So instead of doing that, why not take Wine, improve upon it, and then just integrate it into Steam and just have stuff automatically play with it and let you still configure it if you need to, but most of the time you don't need to. And that's how we got Proton. I think how well people outside of Linux adapt to Proton is going to be what determines whether the Steam Deck is going to be a failure or not. Most games that I want to play work perfectly fine through Proton. There is a couple of things that are still a little bit flaky here and there. Ender Lilies, for example, has been crashing a lot recently. But I have a feeling that as the Steam Deck comes out, Valve is going to be heavily working on Proton to make sure this thing actually succeeds. But this makes developing with the Steam Deck in mind very different from regular sort of console development, because normally you're going to be targeting a very specific API. If you're making a PlayStation 5 game, you're going to target the PlayStation 5 API. If you're making an Xbox Series X game, I think it's DirectX on the Xbox Series X, but I could be slightly mistaken. But in the case of the Steam Deck, you can target DirectX, you can target Vulkan, you can target OpenGL. Anything that would work on Windows is also going to work fine because you're going to be running it through Wine anyway if it's a Windows binary. However, Valve does suggest targeting Vulkan. This is because Vulkan works on Windows and Linux, so there's less translation that needs to be done. Also, Vulkan is going to be better for battery life, which is very important for a handheld console. Even though Proton works so well, there is a really big problem. On ProtonDB, the top games that aren't working all have one thing in common. PlayerUnknown's Battleground, Apex Legends, Destiny 2, and Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. These all have anti-cheat. Now, the two main anti-cheats that exist are EAC, Easy Anti-Cheat, and BattleEye. And these can work on Linux sometimes, but most of the time, they completely break. However, Valve does say in their FAQ, we're working with BattleEye and EAC to get support for Proton ahead of launch. Now, I've heard a couple of naysayers saying, oh, they're not going to get it done in time. I'm telling you right now, Valve did not start working on this the day they made their announcement. This has been in progress for a couple of months, and they put this in here because they think it's actually going to be done by then. If they do miss the date, I think the console is going to be dead on launch, but I would hope they delay it in the case where it isn't going to be supported. That doesn't fix all of the issues. There are still some DRM issues that need to be addressed. They're not mentioned anywhere that I can see, but I would hope that Valve actually is working on that as well. Honestly, if any company can get this done, it's going to be Valve. I don't know if you know, but Valve is one of the most profitable companies in the entire world per employee. Their company is so valuable, and they have basically nobody working for them. They can very easily employ more people or throw out money to other projects and get this fixed. There's no technical reason why these shouldn't work. I mentioned before that we can install other operating systems, but we can also install other game stores under SteamOS as well. Now, I've seen some articles out there claiming that if you would install something like the Epic Game Store, Origin, Uplay, basically, these would just run under Proton, and all of their games would run under Proton as well. But that doesn't really make any sense to me because that would be very different from the way that Proton typically works. At this stage on a regular system, Proton is only being used to run Windows binaries inside of the Steam client. It would be really cool if every Windows binary under SteamOS was actually being run through it to make it so you basically have a seamless Wine-like experience. I haven't found any official source of information to actually say this, though. It seems like most of the articles are linking back to a really poorly written hands-on experience coming from IGN, where they said that the operating system being used by SteamOS is based on Proton, which literally doesn't mean anything. What I would like to see from the other game stores is firstly having Linux native clients, because a lot of them just don't have that. I know for Epic Games there is the Heroic launcher, but having the official launcher on Linux would actually be really cool, and then integrating Proton into the launcher, like Steam has done, and then if the game only runs on Windows, just letting you easily run it through Proton rather than having to go set up something like Lutris. I know that Epic has had a lot of beef with Valve in the past, but I wouldn't be surprised to see, if the Steam Deck does well, some collaboration actually happening between the two companies. So over on Twitter, Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic, had this to say: "Amazing move by Valve, a handheld PC/console hybrid running the SteamOS fork of Arch Linux, and it's an open platform where users are free to install software of their choosing, including Windows and other stores. The and other stores part is kind of interesting because the Epic Games launcher isn't on Linux, but could it be? Maybe. I don't know. There's a couple of articles getting really hung up on the spec sheet, but without being able to see a proper independent benchmark, it's hard to say what the spec sheet actually means for real-world performance. I'm not going to read all of this out, you guys can read for yourself, but there's a couple of things I want to take away from this. So it has a 40 watt-hour battery, and Valve claims this is going to give you 2 to 8 hours of gameplay. Now, of gameplay is very specific. If they said 2 to 8 hours of runtime, that could mean 8 hours on your desktop. Now, where in this range you're actually going to sit is going to be very game dependent. It's going to depend on whether you have native binaries or you're doing translation, whether the game is a Vulkan game or a DirectX game or maybe OpenGL. It can depend on the load on your system. Is it thermal throttling? All of this stuff is going to play a part in how much battery life you're actually going to get. What I do hope is that you're going to get 8 hours of battery life in more than just games like Stardew Valley. I hope at least some action can be happening and you still get that battery life. It doesn't have a 1080p display, but it's 7 inches. Honestly, that's perfectly fine. It also doesn't have a 16:9 display. It has a 16:10 720p display, so that's 1280 by 800. Now, that does mean in games that don't support a 16:10 aspect ratio, it is going to have black bars, but once again, at 7 inches, 40 pixels on the top and the bottom, isn't really going to be that noticeable, especially when the body of the device is also a dark color as well. You may have noticed the storage here, and this is the main thing that changes between the three models. So the bottom tier model is going to be $400 US. That is going to be 64 gigs of eMMC storage, which is basically the same thing you would see in like a micro SD card or a thumb drive. Then there is a 256 gig NVMe model for $529, and being NVMe storage, it is going to be considerably faster than what you get on the base model. Then there is a 512 gig model for $649 USD, and once again, this is also NVMe. The only other difference to this device is it comes with an anti-glare screen. Now, you are going to have to minus a couple of gig for the operating system overhead and the Steam client and all of the stuff to make your system actually function. So the 64 gig, I would say, is effectively 61, maybe 60, which really isn't that much. But all of them do have microSD expandable storage. And look, microSD expandable storage is going to be very slow on this one, but it's going to be exactly the same as what you get on the base model, so you're not going to really notice a difference. I have seen people complaining about the base model, saying it just frankly shouldn't exist. But look, at the end of the day, microSD storage is just stupidly cheap. This is $85 for a 512 gig microSD card, so you buy the base model, you buy one of these, and it's cheaper than the next model up, and you get way, way more storage. And for the people who care, there is going to be an official dock. This dock is going to be a separate purchase though, so at the end of the day, you might as well just go buy a third-party dock and get all of the exact same ports anyway. You can plug it into any sort of USB-C dock and it will work perfectly fine. Now, the big question is, am I actually going to buy one? Ultimately, I don't really know. So, Australian pricing is always a mess. It's not that bad in the case of the Steam Deck, but this is going to be $539 dues. And that's a lot of money. That's definitely a lot of money just for an extra gaming console, which I don't really have enough time to use anyway. I might get one. I'm not too sure at this point, but I would never consider actually pre-ordering it. I'm going to wait until it hits the market. I'm going to wait until people actually do reviews of it, and then I will decide. But ultimately, I hope that it does really well, encourages game developers to actually properly support Proton, and gets Valve to continue working on Proton and making it work better for things like anti-cheat, and making just more games work perfectly seamlessly. Any improvements that come to the Steam Deck come to Linux gaming as a whole, and that's good for me, and that's good for everyone else. Let me know your thoughts on the Steam Deck in the comment section down below. So that's going to be pretty much everything for me, and before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim, Donald, Logan, Michael, Andrew, Mitchell, Nathan, David, Carl, Will, Brennan, Chica Bento, Jimmy, Joseph, Josh, Michael, Pitty, Stephen Tees through, Tony Tushar, and all of my channel supporters. If you like to support work, the links down below to my Patreon, subscribe, star, leave pay, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts, and this channel is available over on Odyssey. This was a really long video to record. I don't know if it's going to be really long after editing, but I'm going to go now, so I'm out. I still don't know which outro to actually do.